Hello, and welcome to Godot Community for High School Visual Art 3D. I have included two links to demonstrations. The first is using Bernard Substitute Stain with a watercolor wash to mimic the same quality you might find in an underglaze. And the second is a way to effectively use acrylic paint as a stain to create depth on fired clay.
A technique that I use a lot with my students of all levels is having them stain a Bisqueware piece and then with a Bernard substitute. And then once it has been fired again, applying a watercolor wash. And it gives very much similar quality to the piece as it would if you were doing an underglaze with a stain, but of course at a fraction of the cost. So I'm going to show you the process of staining and then applying a watercolor wash. So the Bernard substitute, and I don't know why it's called substitute, probably the original Bernard has a bunch of lead in it or something, so they started making it differently to make it more, to make it safer. But you want to mix it. It comes as a powder and it's very inexpensive. And you want to mix it to the consistency so that when you brush it, and I like to use a bamboo brush, it's covering, but there's maybe a little bit of translucency. If it's going on like chocolate syrup, then you probably have it too thick. I would suggest nice full coverage. Obviously, a stain's function is to pick up textured areas, but you would even want to stain your untextured areas because if the stain gets on a part of the clay, it is going to fire to a slightly different bone than an area that never had slip on it, or I'm sorry, stain on it. So you really want to get it on the entire surface. And with something like this, I would suggest to my students that they also get the inside. However, I would not have them go back and try to wipe the stain off of the interior. I think it just probably, for me, looks a little bit better having a dark interior. But, you know, if you're doing like tiles or a closed form, then that might not even be a factor. It's pretty, messy because you are painting it on the entire surface, but it does clean up with water and soap. So that's another good thing. So you can see that I have the entire surface covered. So then I'm going to take a sponge, and I usually have my students just do this at the sink so that they can rinse their sponge out. Now, the idea, again, is that the stain, it's Bernard slip, which is why I keep saying that, is staying in your textured areas. If students do not squeeze out the sponge and it's dripping wet, it tends to pull the stain, like you see there, right out of the texture. If students have not carved deeply enough, if the designs are too shallow, then it's going to pull out a little bit more easily. And you can reapply, but sometimes, since this is Bisqueware, if you have already wiped it off with a wet sponge, you may need to wait for it to dry because the slip is not going to want to be absorbed by the form. I usually instruct students that when they are done, it shouldn't appear streaky or smeared. There shouldn't be fingerprints on it. And it should just overall have a clean quality to it. Now, the stain does burn out a little bit in the kiln, and it needs to be fired at a cone 6 for maximum permanence. You can fire it lower, But it seems that at that cone 6, like even if you do it at a 5, it has sort of a light brownish quality to it, and the wear looks a little bit dirty. It's at that cone 6 where you are getting these really nice, clean areas. So as I said, the Bernard substitute is a ceramic material. So this would need to go into a high fire at cone 6. The clay that I use is a cone 6 to 10 clay. So this is on the low end. You could probably get away with firing it a little bit higher than 6, but again, I think it's going to burn out a little bit the higher you go. The next step in the process is going to be applying our watercolor wash. And because this has been fired at a higher temperature, it's lost some of its, it's not absorbent anymore. So because of that, the watercolor really is just going to be sitting on the surface. So once you apply your watercolor, you really need to seal it with a clear acrylic spray. You probably could seal it with Mod Podge or some other, gel or matte medium. But I like the spray acrylic because then it's completely waterproof. So I'm just taking regular Crayola pan watercolors. And if this were bisqueware, that water from the watercolor would immediately be absorbed and that would be dry. But because it is vitrified, we really just kind of have to wait for the water to evaporate. You can build color up. Obviously, with any watercolor, the more or the less water you apply, the more intense the color. And this is really going to be, I call this a watercolor wash because, obviously watercolors have a translucency to them anyway, but you just are not going to be able to get super vivid dark colors. Another thing that I like about this is I don't know, what everyone's situation is in their studios at school, but my students are really limited with colors as when it comes to glaze. We have mostly earth tones and a lot of things that are just more organic. And so those students that really want to incorporate some color into their work might gravitate to this technique. There's a lot of control. So, there's a lot of variables that can happen in a glazed fire. And this is also really forgiving insofar as if students make a mistake, they literally can just wipe the watercolor off of this fairly vitrified clay and then try again. So when I'm finished, I would have a nice colorful skull with a little bit of clay on it. And that is a watercolor wash with Bernard Slip Substitute Stain. Painting clay often gets a bad rap, and I've been guilty of it myself. When I ask students what their plan is to finish something, if they say, I was just going to paint it, they get the, oh, are you sure? You can't think of anything else that you would rather do? And I think for me, anyway, it's because the students that are coming into my class typically don't have the the skills or the finely honed painting techniques that really are necessary to do a quality job of painting. So one thing that I have found that has elevated that is by having them paint their work, but then go back over it and use acrylic paint as a stain. So this one was actually done with tempera paint, believe it or not. So the entire piece was painted in the blocks of color that you see. And then it was gone over with a layer of gel medium. I think it was a matte medium actually. And that sealed that tempera paint. So then the student was able to go back in and take black paint and go over all of the detail and texture and then wipe it away. And it really just gives it a little bit more depth. I think an area that students struggle with when they paint is when they are going from one color to the next, and that line between the two colors sometimes looks a little muddied, or it just isn't refined very much. So by staining, you're getting this black into all of these areas, and it's sort of defining some of the texture, but also cleaning up areas maybe where two colors come together. So even if students are being or having success or able to paint with a little bit more skill, I think that the application of paint as a stain often gives more depth to the work. Also, in a previous video, I talked about actually using Bernard Substitute as a stain. And if that isn't, if you don't have access to it, or you aren't interested in doing yet another firing step, then this gets very much the same type of quality insofar as you're really picking up the texture and detail. So this has been painted with color. But if you had something that just had a bunch of texture, you could just do an all over color of, whatever color you choose, whether it be something similar to what a fully fired clay body might look like, or you want to do something a little more unconventional, you can. But I had this painted in just regular color. I'm going to take a little bit of brown, and I like to use brown as opposed to black. And I'm just going to go in, and I just use my finger. And what's important when you are staining with paint is that you're only doing little areas at a time. And the reason being is I'm using acrylic. As that acrylic paint starts to dry, it's not going to want to wipe off your form. And you can see that it's starting to pick up all of these textures. If you have deeper textures, you may need to get a brush involved, or if you're just not interested in revisiting your youth and finger painting, you might want to get that brush going. Get in there. And I just have a damp sponge that I'm using, and I usually keep a bowl of water handy so that I can rinse that sponge out once in a while. And I think you can just start to see the amount of depth that it's creating. And unlike when I was talking, if you watched the demonstration with the Bernard Substitute, you would only need to stain the areas that you want to pick up that depth, because obviously once you wipe it off, any area that's wiped is going to be the same white as areas that never had the paint on them to begin with. Use moderation with how wet your sponge is because you don't want to pull the paint out of the texture. And there you have it. Nice depth and detail.
I hope that this information was helpful and something you can use in your classroom. Thank you.